Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Mr. V. I'm going incredibly corporate today, and here is my A Different Beat mug. Today I thought we'd carry on from a little bit of what we were doing yesterday in terms of fiscal policy and talk about indirect taxes. In order to participate with Coffee with Mr. V, then, you know what you need to do. Go and grab yourself your favorite liquid, put it in a cup, a mug, or a glass. Come back here and we're going to do the synchronized sip, and that's going to be the best part of your day. 3, 2, 1. I love coffee. So here we go. Indirect taxes as opposed to direct taxes. Direct taxes, remember, are imposed on individuals or on firms. They're imposed on wealth or income. Indirect taxes then are taxes on spending, taxes on sales, and they can be passed on, as we'll see in a moment, onto somebody else in order to pay. A direct tax, you can't pass it on. Somebody else can't pay my income tax for me. But in terms of an indirect tax, you'll see in a moment that we can pass that on. So a couple of examples of indirect taxes that you will come across in your 2 years of the A-level or the IB specification. Sales taxes. In the UK, we call that VAT. But in other parts of the world, you don't. You might call it GST, Good Sales Tax, or you might just call it sales taxes. If you've ever traveled to America, you know how annoying it can be because between the different states, they have different sales taxes. So a pair of jeans, you have a price tag on them, you take it to the till, and then they add the sales tax at the end. That's because they don't have a kind of a consistent sales tax throughout America. It's individual states. So when the firms roll out their supplies, they don't go with a price tag as such, incorporating the sales tax. They just have the price tag with the sales tax removed so that the retail outlet can do the rest. That was a little bit of an aside. You don't need to know that. That was just an aside. Another one, an import tax. There's a slightly different diagram to that one, which we can do today as well. And excise duties. An excise duty is a tax on a demerit good. A government is likely to use that in order to decrease consumption of a particular good, a good that has negative externalities on it, such as cigarettes, alcohol, petrol, increasingly sugar or sugary drinks as well. So here we go. Diagrammatically then, how do we show an indirect tax being imposed? So let's call this the market for cigarettes then, okay? A downward sloping demand curve. Let's remember why that's downward sloping. It's because of the law of diminishing marginal utility, that as we consume more of something, the price we are willing to pay goes down. That's because the utility we gain starts to diminish, okay? We have an upward sloping supply curve. We've been doing a lot of theory of the firm recently, so you'll know that in actual fact, that supply curve looks like a Nike swoosh. It is the MC curve. But for the purposes of this micro diagram, we can ignore that hook shape at the bottom and just go with the upward sloping aspect, okay? The reason then it's upward sloping, go back and check episode 1, okay? It's the law of diminishing marginal returns this time, which basically says, as we increase a variable factor to our production, the production process gets less efficient and therefore marginal costs, MC, start to rise. And therefore the firm will have to charge a higher price in order to cover its production costs. Anyway, wherever demand equals supply, that's where you get the equilibrium price. But right now, the government is going to impose an indirect tax onto this product. So the way we illustrate this is we say it's a tax on the producer. It effectively increases the costs of production to the producer. So we knew that that level of output, I don't know, we can call it N1, okay, it costs that amount of money to make. But then the government is imposing a particular tax, I don't know, let's call it £1, a £1 unit tax on this particular product. So if it costs £1 to make, the firm now has to sell it for £2. If it costs £2 to make, the firm now has to sell it for £3. If it costs £3 to make, the firm now has to sell it for £4. And we could do this all the way along the supply curve. And when we then connect the dots, what we get is a new supply curve, or let's call it S2 rather than S1. That is a 2, okay? And you can see that the supply curve has shifted to the left. To be honest, if you call it shifting to the left or shifting upwards, I don't really mind. It kind of ends up in the same thing. But just bear in mind that straight line distance, that distance between the two supply curves, S1 and S2, that is the tax. In this scenario, it's a unit tax or a specific tax, which means that the tax is the same all the way through, regardless of whether it's N1, N2, N3, or whatever it might be. Okay, the tax is always, in this scenario, £1. So what has that done? Well, it's increased the price to P2. And if I bother to put some Q on this as well, it has reduced consumption down from Q1 to Q2. And there we have it. That is the imposition of a unit indirect tax onto a particular good. Common mistakes then. One of the common mistakes is that students automatically feel that P2 must be P1 plus the tax, P1 plus £1. It isn't. If you have a look at that second equilibrium, or in fact, let's go back to the first equilibrium here, and then we draw that straight line distance, because remember, the straight line distance is the level of the tax. You can see that that P value there is higher than P2. So the price has gone up, but it hasn't gone up by as much as the tax. What that means is if the pack of cigarettes was £10, the government has imposed a £1 tax, but the final price isn't £11. It's more like £10.50. So what's happened? Well, part of that indirect tax has been passed on. Remember, we defined indirect taxes as being taxes that could be passed on to another economic agent. In this case, producer is passing it on to the consumer, but only part of it, okay? 50p in this scenario. What's happened with the other 50p? Well, it has been absorbed by the producer. The producer is essentially accepting less revenue. He's sucking up the half of the tax and coming out with less revenue and indeed less profit. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the new kind of revenue boxes and government revenue boxes that we can draw. So P2, Q2, that box there is the total amount of revenue that the firm will receive, asterisk, obviously minus the government revenue that they will get from this tax. How much government revenue will the government receive from this tax? Well, it will receive tax revenue on all of the units from 0 to Q2, so that distance there, plus or multiplied, sorry, by £1, the unit tax, which is that straight line distance there. So we could, in fact, draw a little rectangle here that shows us government tax revenue. The box then that is left here, now kind of annotated by the orange circles, is government revenue that, the firm's revenue that is remaining. If we look in a little bit more detail of this government revenue box then, what we say is that this is the consumer burden or the consumer incidence of the tax. We say that because that's essentially the price change that the consumer has seen. The consumer hasn't seen a £1 price increase. The consumer has only seen a 50p price increase. And therefore, the burden of that £1 tax has only partially fell on the consumer, not all. On the other hand, the producer, the incidence of the tax on the producer is the lower half of that box. By the way, that box is being cut in half by where that first equilibrium was. It won't always be half, as we'll see in a moment, okay? But the bottom half is the producer incidence. That is the amount of, essentially, the amount of the tax that the producer has had to soak up, has had to absorb in lost profit because of the government revenue. And in this case, it's 50p as well. I made it exactly half, because even though the selling price now is £10.50, the amount of money per unit that the firm is receiving is only £9.50. So again, it's 50p lower than what the original price was to the producer. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies and puts things in a little bit more detail. However, indirect taxes can come in two distinct types. We've got the unit tax going on here, but the other one is a percentage tax or an ad valorem tax, which VAT, for example, is an ad valorem tax. It's 19%. Wrong, it's 20% these days. Getting confused with corporation tax. Apologies. We can draw our diagram in exactly the same way. Downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve, and a market equilibrium of P1. And let's say it is 20% VAT. Now, if the good N cost £1 to make, plus 20p, wrong, 20% is 20p. So the firm would have to sell it for £1.20. If the good costs £2 to make, plus 20% is 40p. If the good costs £3 to make, plus 20% is £3.60. If the good costs £4 to make, plus 20%, £4.80. And hopefully you can see where this is going. If we start to join these dots up, what we'll see is that the supply curve is again shifting to the left or shifting upwards, but it's more of a pivot shift, okay, rather than the parallel shift that we had up here. Okay, so unit tax or specific tax, you should always be doing a parallel shift of the supply curve. An ad valorem tax, or sometimes called simply a percentage tax, you should be doing a pivot shift of the supply curve. Now, of course, if you get a question that's all about taking taxes off rather than putting taxes on, it's the same detail, but just reversed. So if you were getting rid of a unit tax, you'd be bringing the supply curve to the right or downwards in a parallel movement. If you're getting rid of VAT or reducing VAT, an ad valorem tax, then you would be pivoting it, but you'd be pivoting it like that. Okay, let's have a look at this again. We see the same thing happening. P1, there is upwards pressure up to P2. And Q1 has fallen to Q2. Now, for some reason, students often make a very weird error in trying to work out tax revenue, and they forget all about all the good work that they learned from unit taxes over here and suddenly start shading in all sorts of weird areas. No need to do that. The selling price is P2. If the selling price is P2, then you're only applying the percentage tax to P2 and not a different percentage for all the units all the way up to Q2. Okay, it's just a percentage of Q2. So if P2 happens to be, let's make the maths easy, £10, and the percentage tax is 20%, then the firm is only receiving £8, and it will be receiving only £8 on all of those units, not just on that last unit and then less tax on the other ones. So the tax revenue box is exactly the same. We also say that the consumer burden is in the same place because the price has gone up to consumers by the difference between P1 and P2, which isn't the amount of tax, remember, because the amount of tax is that straight line distance between the two curves. And the lower half or the lower portion of that box is the producer burden, because that's the amount of loss of tax revenue that they have had to suffer as a result of the imposition of the tax. Great stuff. So hopefully you've managed to stay with me up until now, and you now know how to draw indirect tax diagrams. There's one other thing that I want to do. Well, there are two things. Just as I'm doing this, I'm really realizing that I should make the link back to macroeconomics, because that's the reason I decided to do this today, because we've been doing fiscal policy. What I tried to show yesterday was that if you are to increase indirect taxes, such as sales taxes, so it has to be a tax that affects all products. You couldn't say that an excise duty on cigarettes does this for the economy, because this is the economy. This is all markets. Okay, it's not a price change of cigarettes probably won't have a huge effect on the price level of the entire economy. Increase VAT, which is on everything, and you will get a price level change on all things in the economy. It's a shift upwards of the AS curve, or if you prefer the classical economics view, it's a shift upwards or to the left of the short run aggregate supply curve. Okay, in my view, those two movements are exactly the same. It just depends whether you're using the Keynesian ADAS or the classical ADAS. Excuse me. So the last thing that I wanted to do is just relate or show you how PED and PES relates to the imposition of indirect taxes. I'm going to assume a unit tax here because it makes everything easy, but these could easily be applied to ad valorem taxes or percentage taxes as well. So let's draw a very elastic demand curve, but the same supply curve movement. What I mean by that is I've tried to keep these supply curve movements as similar as possible, okay, just to make the point I'm trying to make here is as obvious as possible. So put P1, P2, put Q1, put Q2, read up from Q2. There's no point reading up from Q1 anymore. Q1 was the first equilibrium. It's all about Q2 now. This is the number of units that are being taxed. You draw the straight line distance in from there to there, and that's our tax revenue box. Consumer burden, producer burden. I'll do the same thing here. P1, P2, Q1, Q2, read up from Q1 to the old supply curve, and there's our tax revenue box again. And you should hopefully see a bit of a change. Perhaps I should have emphasized the elasticity of that demand curve a little bit more in that particular diagram. But hopefully you can see that there is a difference. With the inelastic demand curve, for say something like cigarettes, for example, which are very addictive, or petrol, for which there is very few alternatives, if any, okay, you put a tax on there and producers are able to pass a lot of the tax on to consumers. The price has gone up by quite a bit, and you can see that the consumer burden is much greater than the producer burden. So with inelastic demand, any increase in the indirect taxes is likely to lead to a large price change and a large consumer burden. On the other hand, with an elastic demand curve, hopefully what you can see here is that the consumer burden is much more reduced, that the price change between P1 and P2 is relatively small, and actually the producer is now got the larger burden of the tax. Now, this shouldn't really be a surprise. With an inelastic good, producers know that they can pass on a lot of the tax onto consumers and increase the price because it's inelastic. Consumers will continue to buy it. On the other hand, with an elastic demand curve, producers are going to be fearful of passing on too much of the tax to consumers, because if they do, they know that even a small increase in price is going to lead to a large fall in sales, so they tend not to, and therefore that explains a bit of the difference. And then obviously you can go as extreme as you like with this. So if you had perfectly inelastic demand, then the price, actually this is the only scenario in which the price change from P1 to P2 will actually be the entirety of the indirect tax. So in this scenario, the entire burden is with the consumer. Prices have risen by the amount of tax. Going back to our previous example of the £1 tax, prices have gone up by a full £1 in this case. Or we could do that scenario. We could imagine perhaps that this is perfect competition and we impose a tax there. And this one is slightly harder because P hasn't changed. The price is still the same. So where's the tax revenue box? Well, you remember you use Q2, you read up to the first supply curve, S1, you draw across there, and that's your tax revenue box. And now this is entirely producer burden. The producer has absorbed all of the indirect tax and hasn't passed any of it onto the consumer whatsoever. The consumer is still paying the price of P1. So there we go. That's indirect taxes done as full as possible. Okay. What we've done then is we've looked at 3 different examples. We've explained the reason why the diagram moves in the way that it does. We've looked at unit or specific taxes, compared to ad valorem and percentage taxes. We've then also looked across to macroeconomics and seen how, I mean, I only did it from the point of view of increasing indirect taxes in the macroeconomy, but equally, if you were to decrease indirect taxes like VAT, you would see the opposite of that happening. And then we've looked at how elasticity affects it. Admittedly, I've only done it through the demand curve, but if you want to challenge yourself by looking at the supply curve as well and how that might affect the burden or incidence of the tax as well, by all means, have a go. Right, that concludes the episode today. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time. Cheers then.